Why Nations Fail, The Origins of Power, Prosperity, and Poverty by Daron Acemoglu and James A. Robinson is a landmark work in political economy that addresses a fundamental and age-old question. Why do some nations prosper while others remain mired in poverty? Published in 2012, the book combines historical analysis, economic theory, and political science to present a compelling argument about the central role of institutions in shaping the destiny of nations. The central thesis. At the core of Acemoglu and Robinson's argument is the assertion that inclusive institutions lead to prosperity, while extractive institutions lead to poverty and stagnation. Inclusive institutions, both economic and political, are those that provide a level playing field, protect property rights, encourage innovation, and allow for broad participation in economic and political life. Extractive institutions, in contrast, are designed to extract resources from the many to benefit the few. These institutions are often maintained by authoritarian regimes or elite groups that suppress innovation and competition to preserve their power and wealth. According to the authors, the reason why nations fail is not geography, culture, or ignorance, as other theories have claimed, but rather the political and economic institutions that shape incentives and behaviors over time. Rejection of alternative theories. The authors systematically dismantle three popular, but in their view, flawed explanations for global inequality. 1. Geography hypothesis. This theory argues that poor countries are poor because they are located in unfavorable climates, e.g., tropics with disease, poor soil, etc. Acemoglu and Robinson counter this by pointing out that nations with similar geographies often have vastly different outcomes. For example, North and South Korea share the same geography but are economically worlds apart due to differing institutions. Culture hypothesis. Some suggest that cultural factors such as religion, work ethic, or family structures explain economic success. However, the authors argue that culture is shaped by institutions, not the other way around. They give the example of the Protestant ethic theory and point out that Protestant regions often had inclusive institutions that encouraged economic activity. 3. Ignorance hypothesis. This theory assumes that poverty results from leaders not knowing what economic policies are best. Acemoglu and Robinson reject this, noting that many leaders knowingly pursue harmful policies to maintain their grip on power and extract wealth. The importance of political institutions. Political institutions determine who holds power and how that power can be used. For inclusive economic institutions to thrive, they must be supported by inclusive political institutions, those that allow for pluralism and constraints on power. When political institutions are inclusive, a broad coalition of society has a voice, and this prevents a narrow elite from monopolizing power and resources. However, extractive political institutions often support extractive economic systems. For example, a dictatorship may rely on monopolies and forced labor to enrich the elite. Even if a nation with extractive institutions experiences short-term growth, as seen in some oil-rich autocracies, the lack of innovation and inclusive participation eventually leads to stagnation. Historical case studies. Acemoglu and Robinson use numerous historical examples to illustrate their arguments. The Glorious Revolution, England, 1688. This event led to the establishment of parliamentary sovereignty and property rights, paving the way for the Industrial Revolution. The inclusive institutions that emerged created conditions for innovation and economic expansion. Colonial Latin America versus North America. In Latin America, Spanish conquistadors established extractive institutions such as encomiendas and repartimientos to exploit indigenous labor and resources. In contrast, British colonists in North America, especially in places like Massachusetts, established more inclusive institutions that promoted property rights and self-governance. The divergence of North and South Korea. Post-World War II, Korea was divided into two countries with similar cultures and histories. Over time, South Korea adopted inclusive institutions, while North Korea became one of the world's most repressive regimes. This divergence led to stark differences in economic performance and quality of life. Botswana, often cited as an African success story. Botswana maintained inclusive institutions after independence, allowing it to avoid the resource curse and achieve steady economic growth. Leaders chose to build strong property rights, democratic processes, and anti-corruption mechanisms. The iron law of oligarchy. A critical challenge the authors identify is the tendency of elites to resist reforms that threaten their power, a phenomenon they call the iron law of oligarchy. Even when inclusive institutions begin to emerge, elites often attempt to capture them or roll back progress. For example, the French Revolution initially promised political inclusivity, but quickly gave way to authoritarian rule under Napoleon. Change is possible, but it often comes through what they term critical junctures. Major events like wars, plagues, or revolutions that disrupt existing power structures. Whether these moments lead to inclusive or extractive outcomes depends on the strength of civil society and the distribution of power at the time. Modern implications. Acemoglu and Robinson argue that their framework is relevant today in understanding why some developing countries struggle with corruption, weak rule of law, and low innovation. They caution that foreign aid and top-down development programs often fail because they do not address the root institutional problems. Without political reform, economic reforms are unlikely to be sustainable. They also warn that even successful nations are not immune. The United States, while historically built on inclusive institutions, is not guaranteed continued prosperity. The authors express concern about growing political inequality, lobbying, and the concentration of wealth and influence, which could erode inclusive institutions over time. Criticisms and debates. While widely praised, Why Nations Fail has faced criticism. Some economists argue that the book downplays the role of culture, geography, and external factors like trade and globalization. Others believe the theory is too deterministic and overlooks cases where growth has occurred under extractive regimes, at least temporarily, e.g., China. Despite these criticisms, the book has had a significant impact on development economics and policy discussions. Its emphasis on political economy and institutions has influenced organizations like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund to consider governance and institutional quality more seriously. Why Nations Fail presents a powerful and accessible theory of economic development rooted in the role of institutions. Through a wealth of historical examples and logical analysis, Acemoglu and Robinson demonstrate that inclusive political and economic institutions are the foundation for prosperity. Their work suggests that meaningful development requires more than good policies. It requires transforming the very structures of power and participation within society. Understanding why nations succeed or fail is not just a theoretical exercise. In a world marked by rising inequality, democratic backsliding, and economic uncertainty, the lessons of why nations fail are more relevant than ever. It calls on citizens, policymakers, and scholars alike to recognize the importance of inclusive institutions and to defend and build them wherever possible.